Let's do an analysis of this Beethoven Bagatelle. And there are a couple of things I want to point out. First, I want to introduce a new, well, not a new texture type, but a new example of polyphony. So it gives us a good example of that. It also gives us a good example of another period form. But let's first listen to it. Maybe we talk first about the form, since I think it's fairly easy to hear. We get a half, well, we're in G minor, so we know that this is, interestingly, this is actually not easy to analyze. You can only analyze this as a G minor chord once you get here. But it's close enough. We'll talk about it in a second. But we do get, if we're in G minor, then this is the 5 chord, and it sounds like something's ending. We get this rest, so I'm going to say that this is some kind of half cadence. And then we see here we get another half cadence. And then we get a repetition, basically an exact repetition, which ends here. Another half cadence. And then we look at this and we say, well, it's more or less like the second phrase, but we don't get a half cadence actually. We get 5 to 1. Both are in root position, and this note is a tonic, so we get a perfect authentic cadence. So before when we talked about the parallel period, we saw that we had a half cadence and a perfect authentic cadence. And those two things come together to form a period. And we looked at the phrases themselves and the material, the content of the phrases. We saw that the second one was more or less a repetition, where there's a change at the end and we get a new cadence. So we call that a parallel period. If we look at this, we see that it's basically, it's basically twice that. That is, we get a phrase here, half cadence, and we get another phrase. Now this phrase is actually contrasting from this one. But it ends in a half cadence. Then what we get is a repetition. This phrase and then a repetition of the second phrase, same thing. But this time we get a perfect authentic cadence. So the way to describe this then is as a double parallel period. Double because it's 4 phrases rather than 2. Parallel because the first 2 are basically repeated in the second 2 phrases, the last 2 phrases. And of course, we need 4 phrases to make this happen. And each of the first 3 cadences need to be weak cadences. And then with the PAC, we get a close off, and we terminate the period form. So this is a really good example of a double parallel period. And it's a good example of how period forms can be expanded significantly to include, in this case, up to 4 phrases. And we'll see an example later on where the double parallel period is actually the entire form of the piece. So this double parallel period can serve as a form for a small piece, like one of these small dances, these dance forms like minuets and gavottes and things like that. Now let's do some analysis. Okay, we're in G minor, and this is a little bit tricky. Someone might say, wait, this is a B flat chord. We have B flat and the D and a D here, and before that, well, it's just a D. So there's nothing to show a C, so we should call it a 3 chord. That would actually be a mistake. It would make, why is that? Well, because it makes no sense for Beethoven, for a composer of that era, to begin a piece on a 3 chord. So we don't want to analyze it that way. We hold off analyzing it. We look here. This is even harder, actually. This isn't a chord at all. We've got a root. It's probably some kind of 5 chord. We get the 5th. We get the 7th. It's some kind of relationship to a 5, maybe a 5-4-3 chord, a passing. It's a passing 7th chord. You could probably analyze it that way, but we'll come back to this one in a bit, and I'll talk a little bit about it. But then we get here, and we get the G minor chord, and then the D major chord in first inversion, or the dominant chord, tonic and dominant. Then we go back and we say, well, it doesn't sound like a 3 chord, so how do we analyze this? This is kind of a weird situation where we'd actually analyze this as a 1 chord in first inversion. Even though we do not have a root to the chord. But the thing is, sometimes harmony isn't explicit, sometimes it's suggested. It's usually explicit. It usually is quite clear, but it's not always. And then we have to use our ears, and we have to use some deductive reasoning to make decisions about what's happening harmonically. And if we go on, we can say this is 1. This is an interesting case of 5 in first inversion, but it's minor. And then we get this guy, and we just talked about him. We get this E flat in the bass. We get a 3rd above it, and we get an augmented 6th above it. Some kind of augmented 6th chord. It's got 3 notes. The 3rd above and the augmented 6th above, it's an Italian augmented 6. To 5. Okay, let's go back to this chord and just fill it in. I had mentioned that, it's a little bit like this, where we don't really get everything complete. We don't get the 3rd, which is important. We get the root, we get the 5th, we get the 7th. And this happens with these passing chords sometimes. We don't get the whole thing, and we can treat them just as passing chords. But for our purposes, and in such a case, you might even just analyze it like this. Just indicate it's a passing chord. But I think it has enough of a quality. You can keep this here for analysis if you wanted to. But it has enough traits of the 5-4-3 chord to write in that it's a 5-4-3. So again, this is a kind of exceptional situation. But exceptions do happen. And again, sometimes harmony is hinted at rather than stated fully. I also just want to very briefly talk about this. It's sort of an additional thing. This is actually a harmonic progression. I'll throw it into the compendium of progressions that we've accumulated so far. This is a very common progression. This 1, then 5 in first inversion, usually 4 in first inversion, and then 5. This is what I call the Passacaglia progression, because you find this all the time in Baroque Passacaglias and ground basses and things like that. This is kind of continuous variation form that existed, was quite popular in the Baroque era. You find it less in Mozart's time. The most famous example actually in the 19th century is probably from Brahms and the 4th movement of his 4th symphony. But this was a quite common progression, and you find composers referencing it, particularly Beethoven. Actually, there's a very famous set of 32 variations for piano by Beethoven. which uses this progression in a much more elaborated way. Anyway, that's kind of a tangential thing, but I did want you to know that this is another progression that you can use. And here what Beethoven has done is basically substituted out the 4 in first inversion for the Italian the Italian augmented sixth chord. One of the nice things about double parallel periods is, well, if you've analyzed a bit of it here, then you probably have analyzed a bit of it here, yeah? Because this is the third phrase. The first phrase and the third phrase should more or less be the same. And all you really need to do is double check your work. So let's just go through real quick and make sure that it's all looking the same. But it pretty much does. Here we're going to get the same thing, this 5, 4, 3, to the 1 in root position, 5 in first inversion. Bring it the 1, we're going to get the minor 5. We're going to get the Italian augmented sixth again. And we're going to get 5. So good, that bit of analysis is done. Notice that also in here we have very few non-chord tones. This one obviously is non-chord tone. You say, okay, so how do we analyze this? Well, let's not worry about analyzing. We could analyze 1 here, but really we only get the inversion clearly right here. But this is we can retroactively apply 1 to this and say that this then is a neighbor tone. This is the chord tone, this is a chord tone. This is the non-chord tone, up, down by steps, so it's a neighbor tone. And the only other thing that we have here is this as a non-chord tone, which you can, well, you might analyze this as a 7th and throw in, rather than saying 5, 6, you say 5, 6, 5. I don't like that nearly as much as just calling it, well, we leap into it and we step out of it, so that's an appoggiatura. I think, this harmony here really sounds like a 5 triad, a dominant triad, not a dominant 7th chord. And that's why I think it makes sense to analyze this as an appoggiatura. It's there just before you go into the 1 chord. It really doesn't have the effect of a 7th, so I wouldn't analyze it that way. There are probably people out there in the world, in fact I'm certain of it, who would disagree with me, and that's fine. That's what people who do theory do. They disagree with each other about, whether or not that's a 7th chord. So, but well, my feeling is that it makes more sense to analyze it as an appoggiatura.